Welcome back, everybody. Clearwater Jazz Holidays, Young Lions Jazz Master Virtual Sessions. Brandon Robertson, welcome back. How are you, my friend?
Man, I am doing fantastic on this Thursday afternoon. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, always. Jazz history, understanding the sound of jazz is your topic today. We're recording all of these sessions for the purposes of Clearwater Jazz Holiday Education and Outreach. For those participating today, if you'd like to send a question to Brandon, please use the chat feature and we will get that to Brandon. And if you have any feedback, let us know. info@clearwaterjazz.com. Speaking of the website, please check it out. We've been working hard. We've got these wonderful resources now that are really being taken advantage of by really students of all ages, the school system and those outside of the school system. One of them is called The Studio, where we archive all of the past recorded sessions organized by general topic and instrument. There's close to 70 sessions up there right now from some phenomenal educators like Brandon and musicians. And we also, if you like to listen, you can check out the Young Lions Jazz Master Virtual Sessions podcast. That's brought to you by our friends at Marine Max Clearwater, and you can listen to all these sessions or some other really neat programs we have, like the Stop Time series with Frank Williams. And the studio archive is brought to you by Blue Water Wealth Management. Shout out to them at Steward Partners. And always a big shout out to our friends at the Al Downing Tampa Bay Jazz Association. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Brandon formally and then turn it over to him. He is an Emmy-nominated music director, professional upright electric bassist, composer, and music educator originally from Tampa. He completed his Bachelor of Arts in Music from the Florida State University in 2009 and a Master of Music in Jazz Studies in the spring of 2016. He is currently the Director of Jazz Studies and Director of the FGCU Basketball Band at Florida Gulf Coast University in Fort Myers, Florida. He is now an honorary member of the Kappa Kappa Psi Mu Upsilon chapter at Florida Gulf Coast University. In 2018, Brandon was nominated for an Emmy Award for Best Documentary for his educational collegiate programs featuring the FGCU Jazz Ensemble. He's a prominent band leader. He's taken his band on multiple national tours, headlining at some of the top jazz venues in the country. And to add to this impressive resume, Brandon has performed with many notable acts, such as the world-famous Count Basie Orchestra led by director Scotty Barnhart, vocalist Carmen Bradford, Jason Marsalis, who I think he just had on his Soul Hour show, which he's been doing, which is phenomenal. You got to check that out. And Marcus Roberts, Marty Morell, the list goes on and on and on. We're so lucky to have Brandon as part of these sessions. He's been featured as a performer and a band leader at various national jazz festivals as well, including his headline debut at the Jacksonville Jazz Festival, Tampa Bay Jazz Festival, and many, many others. And please check out his first debut album. It's called Based on a True Story, BASS''D, Based on a True Story, came out in the fall of 2019 and reached all the way to number 16 on the iTunes Top 200 release. Yeah, baby. Brandon Robertson, the stage is all yours.
Once again, you make me blush. Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. And thank you to the Al Downing Association. Thank you to the Clearwater Jazz Foundation. Thank you guys. Like I say, as always, you guys do a fantastic job with this platform that you have given to all of our youth that is in the Central Florida and now even in the Southwest Florida area. We have now, you guys have expanded beyond your regions, and that's a great thing. And that was a goal of you all that you guys have been trying to accomplish. So I want to acknowledge that first and foremost. Congratulations on that. And thank you for having me part of this. So today's session, the past sessions that I've done have kind of catered towards rhythm sections, and a few have been in general aspects of music and how to carry yourself as a professional, et cetera, et cetera. But I wanted to take the time to talk about history. Now, as mentioned earlier, I teach jazz studies at Florida Gulf Coast University, and one of the courses that I teach that's not actually part of our area, but in the humanities area, is music appreciation. So I teach that class, and majority of the time, the students that are part of that course are not part of music at all. They have no music background. They just like music, or they have an interest in music. Some actually do, and were part of a band in high school, but just decided to do something differently later on in life. But as of right now, it's just, they're just kind of, going with the flow, and they need to get a credit. Now, the one thing that I tell my students is in order to learn how to be understood, you must learn how to understand. Because you can't understand somebody else's perspective if you yourself aren't willing to be open enough to receive their point of view. The same goes hand in hand when you encompass music and history. And when you bridge the two together, you start to understand why certain music was happening, why certain sounds were created, and also historically why certain events that were occurring help shape genres throughout history. Now, I'm going to take a step back. We're going to take just a quick second outside of jazz. We're going to go back to the earlier time. So I'm going to speak about the classical and the Baroque and the Romantic period. Okay. Now, these composers that most people have mentioned, like Bach, Beethoven, Haydn, Brahms, Schubert, we have guys that overlap between classical and Baroque or Romantic period, etc. But one thing that they all had in common was that they collectively had a freedom within their music, which is why people were so receptive to it. And so that freedom is part of history, but it's also against what was also occurring in other parts of the world, which if we were talking about in America, when we talk about slavery, there wasn't freedom. So music or slaves that were learning how to just make up things on the spot or building their own instruments because they only had what was given to them or was in their surroundings. Now they're creating content. They're creating a sound. It's a unique sound because that sound comes very authentic. It's not something that you can just make up or you could just spontaneously replicate and do on the spot. No, this is authentic. When they were singing those Negro hymns, when they were singing those field hollers, when they were coming up with these spiritual hymns on the spot, that is pain. That is real oppression. That was something that they were dealing with. In conjunction to these European Western classical art musicians who were still in their regions dealing with other social and the nobilities that were in the hierarchy dealing with that perspective. So now their freedom and their creativity was scrutinized. So you have two different perspectives here. Now, where I'm going with this is that the one thing I tell my class all the time is that in order to understand music, you have to understand history because history goes hand in hand with music. You need both. You cannot understand what's happening sonically around you if you don't know where it comes from. And not just from the origin of that sound, but historically where it was happening in that moment that helped create that sound. That's very important. As musicians, that's very important for us to know. We have to know that information because in order to play a certain genre, you have to be able to hear and understand how that sound works. So going back to our history lesson here. Now, I bridge you into the 20th century. Now, in 1900, which is where we would chronologically say that jazz had its origins, or jazz had its premises of emerging onto the scene of music, right? And we take it back to New Orleans, and we take it back to the slaves where they were hanging out in Congo Square and where they were able to congregate for only a few hours on a Sunday afternoon and just come together and exchange cultural ideas, exchange dialect, exchange food, exchange rhythms in music. So therefore, with the music, that comes a a spawn of something being created and it's happening, a sound. You got all these different elements. And we take that swing sound from West Africa. So you got these slaves who are creating and as we transfer that sound into a 4/4 pattern that now creates a drive, it creates a pulse, and not a unstable pulse, but a stabilized pulse. Now, this is where I compare those European composers to jazz composers in the earlier days. And I'm speaking in terms of ragtime, 20s, Chicago 20s, and the Delta Blues, Mississippi Blues, the swing era of the 30s, and the creation of bebop. Those musicians who came in that first 40 years of when jazz was emerging, where do you think they were coming from with the music that they were creating? And it wasn't just music that was passed down orally in their traditions, because we have Black music. That music exists within that culture, which helped shape the jazz genre. However, though, musicians like Charlie Parker, Sidney Bechet, Louis Armstrong, these guys actually knew who these classical musicians were. There's actually stories that were told that Charlie Parker would practice out of etude books, classical books, playing through preludes and just running them up and down like nothing, effortless. But those sound, that classical sound helped him broaden his ear to not restrict himself to just what he was growing up in when he grew up in Kansas City. Okay? That right there is history and music bridged together. That's somebody who understood, I can't do this without knowing where it comes from. Because I'm not saying that these European musicians created jazz music. What I'm saying is there's so many sounds around the world that was happening. And somebody who was open enough to accept certain sounds that helped them shape what they were hearing, which then, if you take the song Bebop by Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, you will hear that sound. You will hear that prelude classical sound. There's no way that you could just say he just pulled that out of thin air. That came from somewhere. And I'm not saying that Charlie Parker wouldn't have not made that up. He definitely could have and did. However, there was inspiration that it came from somewhere. So what my point is, and I tell my class, again, this is all tying into a point here, is that you can't do this without history. So now that I've explained a kind of just a brief understanding of why I stress so much about why history is important to understand jazz music if you're going to perform it and become a jazz musician, or even attempt to live a lifestyle where you're emerging into this culture. You need to understand history, not just music history, but history, world history. You see how I didn't say American history, world history, because America was involved in a lot of world events that were occurring while jazz was presenting itself to the world at the same time. Okay. So I'm going to go through a couple of books. Now, I'm not going to describe any of these books or go through a whole synopsis of it, but I'll give you a general idea of what these books basically cover and why I would recommend that they're great readings, because once I had a chance to read them myself, and these were books that were recommended to me by teachers, other jazz musicians, even some that wrote their own books, and then they were like, hey, check my book out, you know? So I just have a few that I wanted to talk about. Now, the first book is written by a jazz drummer who was not only highly respected, but everybody considered him one of the best band leader drummers of his era because of his style, his poise, the way he carried himself. And he actually came out with a book where he interviewed 29 jazz musicians. Now, these 29 jazz musicians were at the top of their game. We're talking like, if I had to give you a modern day like list of musicians that we're talking about, I would say of this era and I'm speaking of all genres, man, a Jay-Z, a Timberland, a Drake, those really big names. He was interviewing these jazz musicians like Miles Davis, Coltrane, Monk, Dizzy, Blakey. These are heavy hitters. You know what I'm saying? And this book is called Notes and Tones by the drummer Art Taylor. Now, this book is very heavy, and I to some degree it might be a little over the top for whatever the age range who reads this book, but I recommend it because I went back and found a couple of those interviews in that book that he discusses social injustice and how racial inequality will continue to exist as long as people continue to accept it. It's when we don't accept it no more, it's when it won't exist anymore. And this was quoted by Thelonious Monk. And I'm thinking it's 2020, and exactly his quote is exactly what's happening right now. In that book, it gives you an insight of what a jazz musician was dealing with during 1950 until 1969. So we're talking about the civil rights movement. We're talking about pre-era into Vietnam. We're talking like a lot of things that were happening globally and in-house within America. And these jazz musicians during this era, during that 20-year period or 19-year period, was at the prime of their careers, some of them. And this book gives you a great insight of why certain songs, that they talk about certain songs that they wrote. And some of these songs, some of you young musicians might have performed some of these songs before. And you'll get the backstory on why these songs were created. He interviewed Mingus. Mingus' interview is probably the most heaviest interview in that entire book because he talks about the injustice that was happening in Arkansas, and in which, if you listen to Charles Mingus' album, you will get a lot of those songs that came directly from a time period where Mingus was dealing with these racial injustices. Max Roach talks about it. And he talks about the record that he did with Abbey Lincoln. And it's things like that where you start learning about certain albums and songs that your teachers and people are referring you to, and you're getting direct information from the source. So Notes and Tones by Arthur Taylor, I highly recommend that. Okay. Another book. Now this one I will only recommend to college students and above. Not necessarily high school students yet, because this book is too heavy for that. But Miles Davis' Biography, it is wow. And I read it all the way through. It's a very thick book. And I mean, he covers a lot of his life. He talks about all of the time, the time he grew up in St. Louis. He talks about when he moved to New York. He talks about the folks he was living with at the time. He talked about how he got strung out and then his dad had to come and get him. And, his dad was a dentist. And, he goes through the whole spiel of what his life was like. And then how he worked with Charlie Parker, and that experience. And then, the whole transition going in from Prestige to Columbia. I mean, it is great information because he's not only, it's about him, obviously, but he's including other jazz musicians and their stories. And then you get the backstories about how they started and how their careers started, help push them in the path towards Miles, and how they all intersected with each other. So I find that very interesting. He's very raw with it. I mean, he's very open. And it's a great read because now you start to understand, like, man, this was what's going on. Like, you kind of get a great picture of what was happening in 1952. You know what I'm saying? So Miles Davis' Biography by Miles Davis and Quincy Trope. That's a great read. I would highly recommend that one. Another book, which is a book that I got hip to when I was in graduate school, and my professor Rodney Jordan, he teaches jazz styles and analysis at FSU, and he teaches the graduate level of that course. And this was a book that he recommended in his class, and it's called Thinking of Jazz, Infinite Art of Improvisation, and it's by an author named Paul Berlinger. And this book, basically, he went around interviewing different jazz musicians on their gigs, and he would just ask them brief questions about how they're interpreting improvisation on the spot and how they're hearing things. And some will go into long spills about, well, this is what I'm thinking about, and this is the pattern I'm using, this and that and the third. Some will say, well, I'm listening to this particular instrument because this is the person that's giving me the harmony that I can listen for. It's a great read for those who want to learn a little more about the theoretical side of improvisation. Now, I'm not here to say, and I'm not going to go on record to say that there is a theoretical way, and there are sequences and there are approaches, and there is a theory of a way to improvisation. But a lot of these guys are, when you talk about pure improvisation, it is pure from within. It is something within. That's not something you can teach. You can't teach that. And I try to explain that in a way that my students understand that concept, that you cannot teach. I can't teach feel. I can't teach what you hear inside of you. But what I can do is give you a roadmap and a guide and tools to help you emerge that and bring that out of you. Because there is a point when you get to where when you start to improvise, you really are playing what you're hearing. But there's a system that you have to start with to get you going. But that's not the whole end game. That's not the end game. So this book kind of talks about that. Paul Berlinger actually describes, and he goes into very great depth, and he gives examples where he wrote out transcriptions of some of the things he was hearing, and then he would explain it theoretically of, well, this is what they were telling me how they would approach it. So this is a book that I would recommend for more of college students who are beginning college students, freshman level, sophomore level, just to start to get more in-depth of knowledge of behind the scenes of things, okay? Now, another book, I got two more for you. Another book is one that, this one is specific for bass players. Now, you guys know I had to mention a bass book because I am a bass player, so it would be injustice of me to not mention a bass book. But this particular one actually would be pretty hip for anyone because it does not only cover bass, but it does a great deal of historical content behind the bass players and the band leaders that they were performing with. So you're not only getting the bass history, you're getting an extension of those band leaders and their history, and then their records, because at the end of each of those chapters, you have a long list of recommended recordings that you can find easily. They're easily accessible online, okay? So this book is called The Jazz Bass Book by John Goldsby, who is a fantastic bass player. This guy is killing, super killing. But he wrote this awesome book. And this book it gives musical examples of different licks that you can learn on the upright bass. He goes through different patterns. He talks about the Coltrane matrix, which is a system. It is a system that once you break it down and you figure out how it moves, Coltrane was very smart at how he figured this out. And harmonically, it was a great deal. So he goes through that. And then he takes bass players from each decade of jazz, and he gives you a historical content on those bass players and the band leaders that they perform with. So an example, he talks about Bill Johnson. Now, most folks don't know that Bill Johnson was the first jazz band leader in the history of jazz. And when I researched that, he started the first small Dixieland band in New Orleans before he moved it over to California. And this is around 1911, 1912-ish, okay? But this wasn't stuff that was recorded. There's no earlier recordings of his band. And during that time frame, a lot of those jazz musicians did not want to record their music because they didn't want, sad to say that in this context, but they didn't want white America to take their music. And that was what was happening during that time. Again, you have to understand history and why certain things were occurring, right? And so the Jazz Bass Book, he talks about guys like Bill Johnson and their historical content, and then the people he was associated with, which you learn later on a piano player, a very young piano player. His uncle came out of that group. His name is by Teddy Wilson, and I never knew that lineage would had that tie. I had no clue. I would have not known that if I had read this book. He also talks about the swing era, and he talks about William Baum, and he talks about Basie's first bases and Duke Ellington's first bases. And he talks about the time with Jimmy Blanton. He goes through the whole historical content, but he talks about Duke Ellington as well and history about him and the Washingtonians. He goes into all of that detail. It's great information. So this book I would highly recommend for bass players of all ages. Specific when I say all ages, I'm speaking from high school and up. And anyone else who just wants a great read and just wants to have more knowledge about the bass in general, especially for those who play rhythm section instruments and band directors who want to know how to explain the content to their bass players, this is a great resource I would recommend. And last but not least, I had originally Pops, the History of Louis Armstrong, which is also a great read by Terry Teachout, and that's a great book. I have that book, and it really goes into a great perception of Satchmo's life. But there's another book that I wanted to recommend too. And this particular book was written actually by my old trumpet teacher, my trumpet professor from Florida State, Scotty Barnhart, and I also had the chance to work with and perform with him with the Count Basie Orchestra. He wrote a book a couple of years ago called The World of Jazz Trumpet. And this is comprehensive history and practical philosophy. And this book is pretty much a mini encyclopedia of the lineage of jazz history, and not just trumpet, but jazz history. I mean, he packed it. If this was gumbo, this is the roux. This is the straight roux of the book. The information that he just packed it all in there, and it's got all this flavor of knowledge when it comes to jazz trumpeters, and then also how the political, the social, and the musical conditions of what was happening during America in that time frame, which was helping jazz shape its form. And so that's another highlight book that I would recommend as well. This book has been pushed out into the universities, into high schools, and professionals who read it. So this is another one that you should add to the catalog. There's another great book. I forget who the author is because I don't have it on me at this moment. But Thelonious Monk, the Thelonious Monk's biography is fantastic, as well as John Coltrane's. Now, there's many jazz musicians out there. I mean, pretty much I would say all the ones that, and not to say it in this concept, but who aren't living at the moment, are, they have their biographies already published and now somebody's probably written. So what I would recommend is take 3 of your favorite jazz artists or 3 jazz musicians that someone tells you about. Like, okay, if it's Miles, Coltrane, and Art Blakey, okay, they say check those out. Then not only get the record, not aside from just getting the recordings, purchase their biographies, read up on them, really know who they were. I mean, really, because if you understand how they thought and why they did what they did, it would help you understand to process the music that you're internalizing, which will then help you shape your perspective and your perception of what jazz really sounds like. And that's the whole roundup of this whole conversation, is that if you want to understand the sound of jazz, you have to know the history, and not just jazz history, but history, world history, because those events that were happening in the world was helping transpire the music that we got on those records, those classic records. And without those historical contents, those historical events occurring, we might have not captured or received that sound that we heard, that we now utilize and we're trying to emulate into our existence currently in 2020. So in order to really, really understand what's going on and in order to really know how to play this music, my recommendation is learn the history. And that is my final thought.
Brandon Robertson is one of our most frequent guest musicians, and it doesn't take you but 3 seconds into these to see why. Check out the studio archive, and you can see all the prior sessions that Brandon's done with us, and he's going to be back with us in the next coming weeks. Looking forward to some specific ones. He's doing one with Tyler Wertman on playing duo performances coming up on September 15th. And then he'll be back with a topic he's calling creating new music, composition, and charts, which I think will be really unique. And then we're really trying to add more vocalists and sessions about vocalists. And Brandon is doing a session on Tuesday, September 29th, how to accompany a vocalist. So Brandon, man, another great session. Thank you so much for being part of these. We can't wait to have you back.
Thank you all, and to the Clearwater Jazz Holiday Foundation. You know, as I've said it over and over again, you guys are fantastic. I really love what you all are doing, and this is a wonderful thing that you are providing not only to the community but to all the teachers, man, especially during this pandemic. You know, the pandemic has really subsided a lot of the classrooms. A lot of the classroom looks like ghost towns now. And, you know, it's sad that a lot of students have to accommodate their musical experiences through a viral experience. And now with these type of resources you're providing, man, it feels like they're not missing a beat. It's just a different approach, you know, in a different setting. So kudos to you all in the Al Downing Foundation. Everybody that's doing all the wonderful things in Tampa. Thank you guys.
Yeah, it means a lot, Brandon. Thank you so much for those kind words. It motivates us to want to keep going and you know, expanding the reach and doing more of these for sure. So on behalf of the Clearwater Jazz Holiday Foundation and all of our supporters, thanks to those of you participating today and listening or watching in the future. Stay safe out there, please. Be well. Keep playing. And Brandon, we will see you soon.
Thank you, guys. Take care. Have a blessed day. Thank you.